It had been raining since first light. A half-hearted, apologetic sort of rain, as if the sky itself were reluctant to disturb the hush that had settled over Brasenose. The stones, those old and patient keepers of memory, glistened with a sheen that blurred their age and sharpness alike. I'd always preferred Oxford under cloud. Too much sun made the place feel theatrical, self-aware. Under grey, the city withdrew into itself, and in that retreat, it became truer. I wasn't meant to be at Brasenose that morning. I'd taken a wrong turn, if one believes in wrong turns, and found myself drawn into the quad by the sound of a broom sweeping lazily beneath one of the arched cloisters. I've always found the sound oddly comforting. Not the aggression of cleaning, but the slow performance of ritual. The man sweeping didn't look up. He didn't need to. There was nothing urgent to his work. Somewhere to the left, just beyond sight, a woman laughed, the sort of laugh that begins freely and then catches itself, as if remembering the presence of walls. A door creaked shut a moment later. Silence returned. I wandered, as I often do, past a bronze sundial, past an old notice board with yellowing announcements and a single red thumbtack whose placement seemed too deliberate. I remember thinking that someone had meant to take something down and lost their nerve. In the buttery, a copy of Septuple, The Times, sat half-folded on a sticky table beside the detritus of a lonely breakfast. Marmalade, mostly untouched. Cold coffee, a paper napkin crumpled into a spiral. I glanced at the headline only out of habit, not expectation, but there it was, halfway down the right-hand column. Oxford Don still missing, questions mount over Braseno's disappearance. Dr. Anthony Glendon, Fellow in Moral Philosophy, age 57, missing since Thursday. It's always odd when the dead are introduced without ceremony, as if their vanishing were merely an administrative hiccup. I remembered Glendon vaguely, tall, slow-moving, fond of waistcoats that made him look like an apothecary in a Victorian novel. We had once shared a table at an alumni dinner, not out of desire, but necessity. He'd corrected a quote I'd made from Don, though he was wrong himself. I hadn't said anything at the time. Some errors are best left to flower alone. I folded the paper and slipped it beneath my arm. The porter at the front gate looked up as I passed. "Bit of a mess, this," he said, though he didn't sound surprised. "Is he often absent?" "Never without fuss. Bit of a creature of habit, Doctor. Glendon never missed high table in 16 years, apparently." That's the talk. I didn't reply. I watched a pigeon strut along the lip of the quad's fountain, staring at its own reflection with the kind of arrogance only birds and politicians manage. A bell rang, not melodiously, but tiredly, as if roused too early. Back in my flat, I unfolded the paper again. There was something about the language. The article avoided words like vanished or abducted. Instead, unreachable, absent, no indication of travel. Language that excused the writer from implication, as though Glendon might return at any moment with an apology and a train ticket. But it was the absence of detail that troubled me. No mention of an investigation, no appeal for information, just the faint suggestion that Oxford would prefer its ghosts to remain decorous. I poured myself a measure of Glenfarclas and opened the crossword, though I barely looked at it. My mind had already drifted elsewhere, to the way the porter had said, "never without fuss," and how that fuss was conspicuously absent now. To the silence after the laughter in the cloister, and to the way the headline shared its page with an article on neglected archives and forgotten letters. It struck me then. Not hard, not suddenly, but like rain finding the collar of your coat, quietly and with consequence. Something was wrong in the quad. It was Lewis who brought the file. In his usual manner, slightly apologetic, as if even paper could bruise. He stood by the radiator in my office, warming his hands, watching me leaf through the thin envelope as though it contained a verdict on all of us. The report was bland in tone and mercifully brief. No dramatic headings, no sirens in ink. Just the university's language. Careful, clean, and quietly damning. Dr. Anthony Glendon, under review for professional misconduct. Allegations vague, sources redacted, timelines softly blurred. The sort of document written to be shelved, not read. Lewis cleared his throat in the silence. The dean says it's internal. Nothing criminal. She used the word sensitive twice in one sentence. That's usually a tell. I nodded, but my thoughts had already drifted. Internal. Sensitive. These are the words Oxford whispers when it wishes to forget something before it is remembered too vividly. I'd seen enough of them to know. When the past begins to stir beneath your feet, the first instinct is not to confront it. It's to carpet the floor. I visited the dean that afternoon, Margaret Haldane, a woman of precise diction and deliberate silences. Her office smelled of tulips and linseed, and there was a large oil painting behind her desk. A woman on a hill, arms raised toward a storm. I remember thinking it was a strange thing to hang in a room devoted to symmetry. She offered tea. I declined. She didn't press. Glendon, she said, had taken a leave of absence some weeks ago. The official record stated stress-related illness, but the implication, pressed between each sentence, was one of self-imposed exile. I asked her whether the college had spoken to the ethics committee. She smiled faintly. Not with amusement, but with the studied neutrality of someone who had practiced it in the mirror. The committee was consulted, she said, but not activated. No formal complaint had reached them. Glendon had chosen discretion. There were whispers, of course. There always are. Her hands, I noticed, trembled ever so slightly as she reached for a letter on her desk. Folded and refolded, its edges gone soft with worry. She didn't show it to me. She merely tapped it with her index finger once, before sliding it back into a drawer. It was a gesture of ownership, not concealment. As I stood to leave, she looked up, eyes pale grey, tired at the edges. Do you think he meant to disappear, Inspector? Or did something find him? I didn't answer immediately. Outside, rain had begun to thread the glass with long diagonal lines. Somewhere, a door creaked and closed. The college seemed to breathe in draughts. When I finally spoke, it was with the caution I reserve for mirrors. I think some men vanish long before they leave the room. Later that evening, I returned to my crossword. One clue had been bothering me since morning. Scholars fall, perhaps, in classic setting. 6. The answer came suddenly, not because of brilliance, but because I'd stopped trying. Donjon. A word for a fortified tower, and within it the word don, surrounded by jaune, an old reference to folly or prison. A don imprisoned by his own disgrace. It wasn't conclusive, but it felt close enough to something. There was a sound outside my window then. Not dramatic, just the soft hush of footsteps on wet gravel. I didn't turn to look. Oxford at night is full of ghosts. Some walk, some knock, and some merely linger at the edge of things, waiting to be noticed. I poured myself another measure and left the crossword half finished. The clue was solved, but the answer had arrived too late to matter. It came in the Morning Post, though the envelope bore no return address, and the ink had blurred slightly, as if the sender's hand had trembled in the final hour, or the weather had conspired to keep the truth at a distance. I opened it without ceremony, expecting some tedious administrative summons or a belated correction from one of Oxford's many pedants, the kind who believe error is a form of sin. Instead, I found poetry, or something near enough. Typed on yellowing Brasenose letterhead, the old crest still ghosted faintly behind the words, it contained just 4 lines. They were clipped from Edward Thomas, or claimed to be, but something was off. The rhythm limped, and one phrase in particular caught at me like a burr. The silence in the lane is not the absence of footsteps, but their memory. I read it again, then again. Edward Thomas had written often of silence and often of memory, but never in that arrangement. The syntax was too modern, too self-conscious. This was not a misquotation. It was repurposing. The act of quoting a poet incorrectly, I've found, is rarely accidental. It's a signal of vanity or intent, or something else too fractured to name. I placed the sheet flat on the desk and lit a cigarette I didn't want. The window beside me had begun to collect condensation. Outside, the world was all slate and drip. I slipped the paper into a file marked Glendon, though there were still too few pages to fill the folder without it appearing faintly embarrassed. What I had so far was atmosphere. A vanished dawn, a Dean who played her truths like a harpsichord. And now, verse from a ghost. The poem unsettled me more than I cared to admit. Not for what it said, but for what it lacked. There was no name, no title, no salutation, only a line that someone had wanted me, specifically me, to see. The implication, however faint, was that I would understand it, that I would eventually hear the footsteps behind the silence. Back in Glendin's rooms, the curtains had been drawn again. Someone, likely a porter, had tidied since my last visit. The place had the careful order of a space no longer truly occupied. His desk was dustless. His shelves are too neat. It's a strange thing, the way a room begins to forget its occupant. I moved slowly, without expectation. Academic clutter, mostly. Greek dictionaries, lecture notes, the occasional bottle of port masquerading as an ornament. Then a volume I hadn't seen before. A Shropshire Lad, spine cracked, cover nearly unglued. Inside, a single line marked in pencil. And the sin I impute to each frustrate ghost is the unlit lamp and the ungirt loin. Houseman, of course. A line I'd always found too proud of itself. But it suited Glendon, or the idea of him, guilt hidden beneath the robes of restraint. I asked Lewis to check the library borrowing records. Not the formal ones, but the old slips they sometimes still kept, tucked into manila folders or forgotten in drawers. If this book had been checked out recently, it would tell me more than a dozen interviews. He looked at me then. That patient, almost paternal look he gives when he thinks I'm chasing shadows. Perhaps I was, but I've found that shadows are often the only things honest enough to stay still. Before I left, I took a final glance around the room. The only light came from a high window where ivy trembled slightly in the wind. I saw no sign of struggle, no hint of departure, only absence, curated like an exhibition, and the faint scent of lavender, or something like it, clinging to the corner armchair where no one now would sit. Bellamy had been porter at Brasenose since before I'd passed through Exeter with ink-stained fingers and hair too long for tradition. He had a face carved by repetition, the kind of face that knew when a bell was about to ring, not because of the clock, but because it had been ringing in his bones for decades. He didn't smile when I approached. Men like Bellamy rarely do. Their memory is their manner. I asked when he'd last seen Glendon. He didn't check his notes. Didn't need to. Thursday evening, he said. Just before dusk. No coat, no satchel. Said he wouldn't be at high table. That was it. His voice didn't waver, the sort of tone reserved for announcing puddings or the weather. I asked what Glendon had looked like. Tired, Bellamy said, but not unwell. He walked slowly, as if the cobblestones were whispering something he didn't want to hear, and he didn't take his bicycle. Still chained in the rack if I wanted to check. I did. The bicycle was there, a battered Rolles, its seat worn into a saddle of memory. The chain had begun to rust in the damp. I ran a finger along the rear tire, slightly deflated, not enough to notice from a distance, but enough to feel. Someone had meant to ride it and hadn't. Back inside, I asked Bellamy whether Glendon had spoken to anyone else that evening. Just said the line. Tell them I won't be at high table. That's all. No specifics. Do not tell the Dean. Not tell Lewis. Just them. vague enough to suggest he expected someone to understand without being named. Vagueness is rarely accidental in men like Glendon. It's cultivated, a form of armor. There was a silence then. Not awkward, just the sort Oxford does so well. Cobwebbed and deliberate. Bellamy cleared his throat and mentioned the incinerator. Something about it had been used earlier than usual that Friday morning. Porter, housekeeping, he said. Not suspicious, just odd. I walked there, not expecting anything. In most cases, you don't find the thread so soon, but luck, or something like it, does occasionally mutter your name. The incinerator was industrial, impassive, a steel box with a slit of regret. I asked if anything had been retrieved from it recently. Bellamy shrugged, then nodded toward the waste bin beside it. Just the sort of gesture that implies nothing and everything. In the bin, folded awkwardly, was a sheet of half-burned paper, edges curled, words barely clinging to ink. I held it like a relic. A few phrases remained legible. To bequeath, if held in trust, regrets unspoken. A draft will, perhaps, or the beginning of one. The signature was missing, as was any proper date, but the watermark on the paper was Brasenoses. Someone had tried to destroy it, but not completely. Not with certainty. It had been dropped in the bin beside the flames, not inside. A hesitation, perhaps. Or guilt. I took it back to my flat, flattened it between two panes of glass, as if it might yet breathe. Then I sat in the window and watched Oxford smoke itself into dusk. The air smelt faintly of leaves and pipe ash. Across the quad, the library lights flickered on one by one, not with purpose, but in apology. That night, I didn't touch the crossword. There was a clue I couldn't face. 7 letters. Legacy undone by fire. Perhaps. I knew the answer before I even picked up the pen. Ashes. But it felt too cruel to write down. Some truths are better left suspended, not erased, not confessed, but held just long enough to stain the fingers. They sat like figures, from a forgotten fresco, arranged by tradition, not affection. 4 fellows of the college, though one had vanished, leaving behind a vacancy that altered the symmetry. The senior common room had that faintly perfumed air of recent conversation and older restraint. Decanters idle on sideboards, sherry glasses without fingerprints, as if the room existed to host memory rather than presence. Dr. Helena Pierce was the first to speak. She adjusted her scarf in the way people do when they'd rather not answer directly. She said she had known Glendon since their postgraduate days. Brilliant, guarded, occasionally cruel. Her words, not mine. She said he had grown distant in recent months, vague in conversation, prone to long silences. She believed he was writing something. I asked if she meant a paper. Not exactly, she said, eyes narrowing. More personal. A reckoning, perhaps. Across from her, Doctor. Lionel Crowthorne rubbed his chin in a distracted fashion, as though still marking essays in his head. He taught theology but lacked conviction or had outgrown it. When I asked about Glendon, he smiled as though at a riddle long since solved. The man lived on contradiction, he said. Professed ethics, practiced ambiguity. But you couldn't call him dishonest, just undefined. Then there was Fenn. Julian Fenn, classicist, poet, and the sort of man who cultivated mystery like a vine along the wall. He looked at me steadily, saying little. When he finally did, it was with the measured pace of someone who speaks not to be understood, but to be misquoted in the right way. Glendon, he said, once told me that the only real sin is the failure to act on one's potential. I found that rather chilling. I didn't respond. Not out loud. There are times when silence becomes a kind of punctuation. The conversation turned, delicately, to Glendon's ethics inquiry. Pierce said she had heard rumors, of course, but the university breathes in rumor. Crowthorne deflected with a story about a misprinted timetable and how it had once nearly caused a diplomatic incident during Michaelmas. Only Fenn looked back at me, unblinking. He asked what I believed. I told him belief was for the cathedral. I dealt with doubt. There was a pause then, thick as cathedral dust. And in that pause, I noticed something. On the sideboard behind Pierce, a photograph, small and dusty. 4 young academics on a summer lawn. I leaned in slightly. There was Glendon, younger, stiffer, Pierce beside him, Crowthorne thinner, Fenn with his hair uncut and his posture ironic. The 4th figure had been cropped. I asked about the missing person. Pierce hesitated, just long enough for the truth to become visible in outline. That was Claire Daubonnet, she said. She left academia years ago. Crowthorne glanced at his watch, a gesture meant to end things. But I filed the name away, like a mislaid bookmark in a volume that someone had intended to return to. Back outside, the stone felt colder than before. The quad had emptied for lunch. Somewhere in the distance, a bell chimed 1. I stood for a moment, watching a leaf struggle in a puddle. Then I opened my notebook, found the crossword I hadn't finished, and considered the clue I'd circled earlier. Shared burden of the learned, possibly lost, 9. I penciled in a word without conviction. Fellowship. Too neat, I thought. Too clean. As I turned the corner, I glanced back toward the common room window. Fenn was still there, watching, or reflecting. In Oxford, it can be hard to tell the difference. Reflections often know more than the figures casting them, and always there is one missing from the frame. The chapel was mostly empty, which suited it. The air inside was still, not from reverence but from disuse, as if the angels had long stopped listening and the pews were content to be ignored. A line of light fell through the clerestory, tracing the organ pipes in dust. I stood near the vestry, staring at the register. The name was circled in red biro, as though someone had meant to erase it but chosen embarrassment instead. E. Harrow. No attendance. Thursday. Evensong missed is no crime, but it is, at Oxford, a disruption. One notices absences the way one notices cracked stained glass. Imperfect silence. She met me on the stone steps behind the chapel, where ivy clung to the balustrade with more devotion than most of the congregation. Evie Harrow, 3rd year reading English, the kind of student who hides in footnotes and speaks as though each word is on loan. She said she hadn't meant to cause alarm. She'd simply forgotten. A headache, a late tutorial. She smiled, too quickly. The sort of smile meant to ward off further inquiry. I asked if she knew Dr. Glendon. Her mouth twitched, the smallest betrayal. Only as a supervisor, she said. He'd advised her on her dissertation, something on confession in early modern poetry. She said it without irony. She mentioned he had once asked her to read a poem, not in the context of coursework, but as a curiosity. He'd said it reminded him of something he couldn't name. She unfolded it carefully from a diary she didn't offer to let me see. The paper was creased in thirds and smelled faintly of cedar. The ink had bled slightly along one edge, as if it had traveled through damp pockets or been clutched too long. The poem was brief. 3 stanzas. Imagery of candles. Wind. A room with 2 chairs, but only one occupant. I asked if she still had the title. She looked away, then back and shook her head. It had been torn off, by accident, she claimed, but the page's edge was too clean. A deliberate absence. The initials at the bottom, a G. It might have meant nothing. And yet, she said there had been no relationship. Not in the way people whispered, just conversations. Late ones, sometimes, after tutorials had ended. He'd asked her what she believed about redemption. She said she didn't know. She still didn't. Her voice trembled only once, when she said she thought he was afraid. Not of exposure, not even of guilt, but of silence. That sort of silence that grows in a man when there's nothing left to answer for. I let her go, eventually, watched her walk across the quad with the careful gait of someone trying not to be remembered. Her scarf blew loose in the wind. Red. It caught, briefly, on the gatepost, then vanished. I kept the poem, not because I needed it, but because it had been given reluctantly. Those are the ones that matter. Back at my flat, I laid it beside the earlier verse. The anonymous Edward Thomas distortion. There was no match in meter, no obvious link, but there was a thematic echo. Wind, flame, absence. I opened the crossword. The clue near the bottom of the page drew my eye. Line lost in darkness, barely spoken. 5. I thought for a while, then wrote the word ghost. It wasn't satisfying, but then most truths aren't. Outside, the rain had returned, tapping gently at the glass with the insistence of memory. I poured a whiskey I didn't finish. Some nights end, not with answers, but with the weight of unasked questions. And a girl who skipped evensong. There's a particular stillness that settles in the Bodleian just after the hour. Not silence exactly, but a withholding. Pages turn like hesitant confessions. Shoes echo farther than they should. I sat at the usual desk, second alcove from the theology section, where the overhead bulb hums faintly in protest. The poem was in front of me again, that clipped and altered verse from Edward Thomas, now creased at the corners from my handling, as though it might yet yield some residue of intent. I'd brought the original collection with me, borrowed from the stacks with Lewis's reluctant signature. He'd looked at me as one looks at a man rearranging the past, politely indulgent, faintly concerned. But I needed to see it printed. Ink doesn't lie the way memory does. The original line, Thomas's own, was clear. The silence is not filled by footsteps, but shaped by them, lingering where they once fell. Not what the letter had said, not even close. The version I'd received had reordered it into something sharper, colder, as if grief had been passed through a sieve of intellect. The choice of words, memory over lingering, absence instead of shaped, wasn't just stylistic, it was directional. Someone was not remembering Edward Thomas. They were rewriting him. And that suggested two things: arrogance and familiarity. I left the library and walked the short path to the old lecture theatre, the one with the peeling architrave and the smell of pipe tobacco embedded in the stone. It was there, months ago, that I had heard Julian Fenn deliver a guest lecture on war poetry. He'd quoted Owen, clumsily, misnamed Sassoon. But what had stuck, and stuck hard, was his confident misreading of Thomas. A confident misreading is more dangerous than ignorance. It suggests an agenda. Fenn had chosen then to say that Thomas believed all loss was a form of self-preservation. I'd made a note of it, not because it was true, but because it had irritated me. And now, here was that same misattribution slipped anonymously into my hand, disguised as homage. It wasn't proof, but it flickered like the start of a pattern. I asked Lewis to check the typewriter, not metaphorically, the actual one. The letter had been typed, not printed, and that narrowed the field. There were only 3 functioning machines still in regular use by Brasenose faculty, all kept in the library reserve room like stubborn pets. He came back later that evening, his coat still damp from the drizzle. Said the under-librarian confirmed one of the machines, an Olympia from the 1970s, had been reported missing 3 days prior to Glendon's disappearance. Not stolen, just unaccounted for. The ribbon had recently been replaced, unusual given the machine hadn't been used for months before that. I said nothing, but let the silence suggest approval. I returned to the poem once more, letting my eyes drift over the clipped syntax, the restrained layout. 1 stanza per line. No title. I noticed then something I'd missed before. The full stop after the final word wasn't round. It was slightly square, mechanical, A detail only a certain kind of machine would imprint, and only a certain kind of person would know how to make it speak again. Back home, the crossword sat on my desk, half finished. The pen rested beside it, uncapped. The clue at the top of the page read, "He haunts through borrowed lines, not by voice, but by pause. 7. I thought for a moment, then inked the answer with unnecessary care. Echoist. Not a real word. But then, ghosts aren't real either. Just echoes with purpose. And somewhere in Oxford, one of them had found their typewriter. They found them behind plaster and dust, buried as carefully as a relic, as if the wall itself had absorbed the guilt and chose, after years of silence, to confess. The workmen weren't looking for secrets, just rewiring, I think, or some kind of damp proofing that wouldn't have been necessary if the building had ever truly accepted time. But Brasenose has always resisted such things. It prefers its memories damp. The slippers were red. A bruised, faded red, not the defiant kind worn by youth, but something more theatrical, more knowing. Silk, it looked like, or something that once aspired to it. The toes were slightly scuffed, the lining delicately frayed. They didn't belong to now. That much was obvious. Lewis met me in the corridor just before the light fell away completely. He looked at them like he might have a dead bird. Said they'd been wrapped in an old scarf and wedged behind a loose stone. There'd been a photograph, too, curled in on itself like paper trying to forget its contents. He handed it to me in silence. It was brittle, and I opened it slowly, the way one might unfold a letter never meant to be read. 4 figures, students by the look. Late 70s, I guessed from the clothes. One of them was unmistakably Glendon, though younger. Cleaner. Pierce, too, her hair uncut, arms crossed against the camera's interest. Fenn, of course, looked straight at the lens like he knew it was a future he was staring into. The 4th figure had been scratched out. Not torn, not burned. Scratched. The face was effaced with a methodical fury. You don't do that by accident, or forget doing it. The slippers, though, they were the kind of thing too loud to be incidental, and too fragile to survive unnoticed. I asked Bellamy whether he remembered anything about them. He thought for a while, his fingers running across his keys like he was playing something silent. Said there had once been a Latin tutor, flamboyant, eccentric, who wore red slippers to formal dinners, even in winter. Long since retired. Nothing improper, he said. Just dramatic. But the slippers weren't men's. Too slight, too delicate. And they hadn't been worn ceremonially. One of the soles had the imprint of a stone, pressed and ghosted. Someone had walked in them, hard and late. I placed them on the table in my flat, beside the poem and the burned draft of the will. My desk had become a kind of museum of unfinished sentences. The photograph nagged. Not just the absence, but the framing. 4 students, no faculty, no date. It had the feel of an informal snapshot, but the pose was stiff, controlled. It looked arranged, like a witness lineup in reverse. I opened the crossword. The clue I'd been avoiding stared up at me, now less challenging than accusatory. They're hidden by what should hold them. 8. A strange one. The obvious answer, shoes, was far too short. I thought longer, thought about stone, about silence, about closets with no doors. Then it came, not as a solution, but a sigh. Insulate, 8 letters, a verb and a verdict. I looked again at the slippers. Not preserved, not treasured, hidden, and the photograph. Not nostalgic, not mourned, redacted. The past, I thought, doesn't rot in Oxford. It calcifies, until someone chips the plaster and finds the soft thing still beating inside. I turned out the lamp, left the room as it was. There are nights when you don't tidy the evidence. You just let it sit beside you, like an old regret in a new coat. And the red slippers waited in the dark, as though they'd never left the wall at all. It had rained all morning, a soft and surreptitious sort of rain. The kind that leaves no puddles, only darker stone and a smell like the inside of old books. I walked to the archive in silence. There are places in Oxford where memory lives more comfortably than people do, and the college archive is one of them. A small windowless room tucked behind the chapel, where dust lingers longer than light. The clerk on duty was new. He had the distracted expression of a man who would rather be writing poetry, but couldn't admit it to his father. I gave him the date, 1979. Student cohort lists, fellowship appointments, minutes from faculty meetings. He nodded and disappeared behind a curtain of index cards. I listened to the way his shoes squeaked on the linoleum. There's nothing so revealing, I've always thought, as a man's footsteps in a quiet room. The file he returned with was thin. I asked if anything was missing. He shrugged. If it wasn't there, it wasn't meant to be, he said, which in Oxford is rarely true. I sat beneath the wall clock and opened the folder. Neatly typed names. Events marked with confident ticks. Appointments ratified with collegiate pomp. And yet, there it was. A gap. Not a blank space. Worse. A correction. A line where a name had clearly been typed, then backspaced over with deliberate violence. The indentation in the paper, the ghost of a letter. A D, possibly, or an O. Not enough to swear by, but enough to lean toward. I flipped further. One page had been misfiled. A memo meant for administrative eyes, not posterity. It referenced a student. Claire d'Aubernay, the name from the photograph, the one who had been scratched out with surgical precision. It said she had withdrawn from the university in Hilary term, citing personal reasons. The tone was clinical, too clinical. And then another memo, misdated by a week. The sort of clerical oversight no one notices unless they're looking for contradictions. This one mentioned a disciplinary inquiry. Allegations of harassment, details redacted in black ink, but even the absence told its own story. The accused, Dr. Anthony Glendon. I sat with that for some time. The room grew colder, or perhaps I did. The heater clicked twice, then fell still. The silence inside those stone walls was different from the usual Oxford hush. It had weight. It pressed. I thought of the slippers in the wall, the photo curled by time, the girl who'd missed evensong, and now, a name redacted not by fire, but by ink and intention. I went back through the list of fellows. Glendon's name appeared that year, as expected. So did Pierce, Crowthorne, Fenn. But nowhere was Claire d'Aubernay's appointment acknowledged, despite a reference in the minutes to a fifth member invited to speak at a seminar on Latin elegy. The record had been adjusted, but not erased. That was the mistake. People forget that documents lie only when asked to. Back in my flat, I opened the crossword. I'd ignored it for days. Now it stared back at me, indifferent. One clue hung at the edge of my mind. Name mislaid from record, but not from memory. 6. I wrote the answer slowly, with the sort of reverence usually reserved for apologies. Shadow. The word didn't feel triumphant, just accurate. I stared at it for a while longer, then closed the book and poured a whiskey I had no real thirst for. In Oxford, ghosts do not howl or knock. They inhabit misprints. They nest in omissions. They hover in the breath between two sentences no one wants to complete. And someone, years ago, had tried to end a story by misspelling it. It was just after 9 when Pierce knocked. Rain clung to the glass like it had nowhere else to go, and my study smelled faintly of whiskey, old paper, and the sort of candle you light without ceremony when the bulb finally gives up protesting. She stood in the doorway in a coat too thin for the weather, holding something close to her chest, like a prayer folded too many times to still count as sincere. She didn't wait for an invitation. I didn't offer one. She moved as though the act of sitting down might absolve her of implication, as though choosing my armchair over the straight-backed wooden one would render everything she was about to say less true. She placed the letter on the table. Said nothing. I read it once, then again. No signature, but the voice was unmistakable. Glendon's. The tone veered between apology and riddle, fragments of remorse, too abstract to touch. She was never meant to carry it. I only wanted the truth to blink once in daylight. But he walked in. The pronouns danced. The grammar hesitated. It was either a confession or a final rehearsal for one. Pierce watched me read. I asked how it had come to her. She said the porter had found it slipped under her door the night before Glendon disappeared. She hadn't brought it forward because, and here her voice failed, she hadn't wanted it to mean what it clearly did. I asked if the she was Claire Daubonnet. She nodded, slowly, as though the movement hurt. And the he? That was where the silence thickened. Crowthorne, she said eventually. Or Fenn. Or both. But not me. Never me. I believed her. More than I wanted to. She looked around my flat like it was a room in a house she'd once known and left too quickly. She asked whether I thought he had killed himself. I said that if he had, he'd done it out of calculation, not despair. There's a difference. She picked up the candle and stared at the flame. Said something odd then, that Glendon had once told her he felt like a man constantly about to be quoted incorrectly. I didn't respond. Some confessions are better left to burn quietly at the edges. Lewis rang just after she left. Said the CCTV from the lower stairwell had come in. No exit footage, no re-entry either. Glendon had descended into the crypt level of the college on Thursday evening, and hadn't been seen since. I thanked him, hung up, poured another whiskey. I thought about the line in the letter. He walked in, and the ambiguity it allowed. Not just a moment of interruption, but of witnessing. Someone else had seen what passed between Glendon and Claire, and whatever they had done with that knowledge had led us all here, to red slippers, typewritten ghosts, and a vanished man hiding in full view of an institution that thrives on its own blindness. I opened the crossword. I needed a distraction, or something like it. The clue, flicker of truth in old Flame's confession. 8. The answer came not as clarity, but as concession. Afterglow. I wrote it down, slowly. Let the ink dry before turning the page. I still had the letter on my desk, and Pierce's candle beside it. I blew out the flame, not because I was finished reading, but because some truth should be read only in darkness, and somewhere beneath the college, in vaults where light isn't trusted. The answer waited. Not to be solved, but to be stood beside. Some confessions don't ask for justice, only company. We found him beneath the chapel, not in the crypt proper, but in the old storage chamber below, the one no one ever quite lists on a map, though every porter knows it by instinct. The door was concealed behind a varnished screen and an optimism that no one would look too hard. Lewis had the key, or what passed for it, a rusted thing that grumbled in the lock like a man being woken before he's ready. We stepped inside together, our boots echoing against the flagged stone in that particular rhythm that seems to belong only to Oxford basements. There was no drama to the scene, just stillness and the soft scent of dust that hasn't moved in years. Glendon was seated upright in an old altar chair, a book on his lap. Houseman, naturally. The same volume I'd found on his shelf, though this one had no annotations, no bookmarks, no attempts at remembering where he'd last been. His eyes were closed, gently, as if waiting for applause that would never come. An empty wine bottle was on the floor beside him. No glass, no note, no struggle. Only silence. The kind that knows things. Lewis said something then. Low, respectful. Something about the lack of violence. But I barely heard it. My attention was on the copy of A Shropshire Lad. Specifically on the way it had been opened. Not to one of the well-trod verses. Not with rue my heart is laden. nor into my heart an air that kills, but to a lesser-known stanza, one I'd not revisited in years. Look not in my eyes, for fear they mirror true the sight I see. I'd once thought it overwrought, but it had a particular resonance now. There were fingerprints, of course. Fenn's, most notably, on the door handle to the stairwell, the screen, a candle stub nearby, the wax melted sideways. Someone had been down here with him. Fenn didn't deny it. He arrived at the station with the precise air of a man expecting poetry to be read aloud in his defense. Said he had found Glendon in a state of, he used the word reckoning, and that he had chosen not to interrupt. Said he left when Glendon refused to speak. I didn't believe him. Not entirely. But I didn't disbelieve him either. When I showed him the photograph, the one from the wall, the one with Claire's face scratched out, his mouth twitched in what might have been a memory. Said she had been his sister. Said she'd loved Oxford more than it had ever loved her. Said Glendon had promised her something once. A recommendation. Or a future. The difference in Oxford is negligible. I said nothing for a long time. Then I told him the only true thing I had left. You were the ghost behind the curtain, not the hand on the knife. He blinked at that, said nothing, then left the room in silence. I chose not to disturb. Back at home, the crossword lay open on my desk like an accusation. The clue I'd circled weeks ago still glared up, stubborn and unfinished. Final line spoken in retreat, barely heard. 6. The answer came not as insight, but as inevitability. Whisper. I inked it in with more care than necessary, then closed the book. Outside, a chapel bell marked the hour. I couldn't tell which. There's a kind of ending that doesn't feel like closure, just stillness, like a verse without a refrain, or a candle burned down to the shape of its own silence. There's a particular quality to the light just before dawn in Oxford. Less a color than a resignation. Not grey, exactly. Something quieter. The city doesn't wake so much as admit that it was never truly asleep. I walked the quad alone that morning. No footsteps but mine. The stones were damp, glossed with a thin sheen that blurred their cracks into something near elegance. Behind chapel windows, I could hear the distant strain of choral practice. Not the full choir. Just one or two voices tuning themselves into something that might later be called harmony. It was the same hymn Claire d'Aubenet had sung, according to the archives. Just once. A chapel recital in her second term. The program still existed, yellowed and folded into a hymn book no one had touched in years. I'd found it by accident, which is to say, I'd found it the only way things are ever truly found in Oxford. Lewis joined me briefly. Coat collar turned up, his expression somewhere between apology and closure. Said there'd been no further evidence in the crypt. No sign of struggle, no confession either. Just the scene as we'd left it. Composed, quiet, deliberate. He asked if I thought Glendon had died for guilt or for love. I said the difference was largely rhetorical. He didn't argue, just nodded, and left. I stayed. The chapel door stood slightly ajar. Through the crack I could see the last of the candlelight giving up against the rising sun. I didn't enter. Some spaces prefer to be observed from the threshold. I thought then about the phrase Glendon had written in his half-letter. I only meant to tell her, but he walked in. Not a confession, not quite, just a line caught mid-thought, like a stanza abandoned, and Fenn. Sitting across from me days earlier with that inscrutable stillness. Not lying, exactly. Just letting the silences do the harder work. The real act had never been the vanishing. It had been the arrangement, the carefully orchestrated sequence of clues, the poem, the slippers, the misquoted verse, like a performance for one. I'd been cast not as a detective, but audience. Back in my flat, the crossword lay where I'd left it, half filled, half defiant. One clue left. Truth withheld, but always seen at the edge of things. 7. The answer came before I even reached for the pen. Silhouette. Misspelt, of course. Deliberately. An extra U in the middle. As if the truth had to be made foreign to be acceptable. I left it that way. Some shadows don't lift with time. They just become part of the architecture. I poured the last of the Glenfarclas. Watched the rain return, soft and insistent. Somewhere, a bell marked the hour, then another. The case, if one could still call it that, was closed. But closure is a bureaucratic word, not a human one. I thought of Claire's face, scratched from the photograph, of Glendon's fingers resting on a book of poems, as though seeking permission to leave, of Evie Harrow tracing her way through a paper no one would ever read aloud, and of the chapel still breathing behind me, filled with a hymn only the ghosts remembered the words to. There are truths you don't pursue, not because they aren't there, but because, once found, they leave nowhere else to go. Oxford never forgets. It just buries, sometimes in paper, sometimes in stone, and sometimes in the quiet between two verses no one ever dares to sing.